All right, we're in 1 Timothy chapter 2 tonight. If you want to turn there, you can. We're looking at 8, 9, and 10. So we looked at verse 8 last week. We're going to look at verses 9 and 10. And then we'll be getting into another section that will slow us down just a tad bit further than what we're already doing. But just as a reminder with this, we're just taking our time through the pastoral epistles. So Timothy, the two letters to Timothy and then also to Titus as well. We'll be mixing and matching some. And that'll cover us on some fronts as we deal with a few things. But just as a reminder in the context from last week that we started, that this section, starting with verse 8, and it really isn't going to end until the end of chapter 3, that Paul addresses another disturbance in the church. So the first chapter and a half, he's dealt with the disturbance of a false teaching, false teachers, false doctrine. Trying to deal with them, trying to contend with that, if you will, trying to correct it so that the Ephesian church isn't taken too far off course. Timothy's left in place to handle that. So we've looked at those disturbances, and so now Paul's kind of expanding in that the disturbances within the Ephesian church, yes, are doctrinal, but they also have to do with moral living and with ethical living as well. And so what he does is that he addresses these. So in this section, 8, 9, and 10, Paul addresses both men and women that are the cause of these disruptions within the church. A parallel to this, I gave you this last week, a parallel would be 1 Corinthians 14, where men and women are creating disturbances within the church as well. So that's something that you want to have. And we'll look at 1 Corinthians a little bit later, not in this lesson, but Lord willing, next week. So as we get into this section, Paul is going to deal with men and women. So last week it was the men that he wanted them to pray with holy hands, without quarreling. One of the things about the disruptions that we need to remember is that even though Paul is not dealing with doctrine, the disruptions within the Ephesian church, it's disrupting the peace of the church, the unity of the church, the mission of it, which is the gospel, which is why Paul keeps bringing them back, bringing the whole church back to the gospel. He does that at the end of chapter 1, does that in the beginning of chapter 2. We covered those, so he keeps coming back. Hey, stay on task. Stay on task. Sometimes it's inadvertent. Sometimes it happens on purpose. And then, of course, the doctrine, sound teaching, if you will. The healthier the teaching, the healthier the church. Then, obviously, the healthier she can be to carry out the mission, which is to promote the gospel. So these are some of them, not all the things that are going on. This is in conjunction for those of you that have been on Sunday morning and Sunday school, where they're covering the book of Ephesians and that. So you've got a really good leg up on the inner workings. Peace and unity and mission, where the gospel are three main emphases within the letter, the Ephesian letter. Paul spends a whole lot of time on those. So it makes sense that with these disruptions, about 20, 30 years later or so, in the city of Ephesus, when Timothy's there as the located minister, that he's going to circle back. These things aren't just piecemeal. We're not going to take it and isolate it. We got to remember not just to see it in the overall context of the letter. We've got to see it in the overall context of church life or body life. And this is something for us. Unity, peace, mission, doctrine, they're still important for us. And we don't need to let things disrupt the peace and the unity. We don't need to let quarreling or anger, division, false teaching, we don't need to let those things creep in and get to us, because the mission is the most important. Because the gospel is. It is our task as a body to take the gospel to the world. That is our task. We can't do that if internally we're at odds, if there is no peace, or if that's being threatened, if that unity is being fractured, so forth and so on. So we talked about men, and so verses 1 through 8 parallel with each other. They highlight the controversy there. There are two parts to this. One was positive, where Paul says in every place. So this is both universal and located. So I want every house church in Ephesus, but then I want this to be for every church, wherever it's going to be. Because Paul understood, or at least God's plan, maybe Paul didn't quite understand it, but God's plan is that these would eventually be put together and all churches would have access to it. Thus, here we are studying it. The other positive, I want men to pray. This is within the context of the assembly. This is within the context of the church life. I want men to pray. And I want them to pray lifting holy hands. We focus so much on lifting hands that we forget the middle word, which is holy. Men, I want you to do it in holiness, to get up and lead a prayer. For us as men for a moment, to get up and lead a prayer in the body, within the assembly, that is a very precious and sacred thing. That's not something to just, this is what we do. There's more than that, and it's holy. And Paul says that when we don't do this, when we're doing other things, when we're allowing other things to happen, we're taking what God meant to be holy and useful and good and healthy for the local church. We end up turning it bad, which is the negative side of this. So Paul tells men, I don't want you to do that. I want you to lift your holy hands. I want you to pray, but do so without anger and do so without quarreling. And we talked about this last week, that anger word that Paul uses. It's not just that you got angry and then now you're kind of calming down. It's an anger that has settled. It's an anger that has taken over the heart. I'm just angry. I'm more than perturbed. I'm more than bothered. I am angry with an individual. There's an indignation there. We talked about Matthew 5 where Jesus speaks of this. If you've got an issue, leave your gift at the altar. Go reconcile. Go do that with your brother. Do that with your sister. Then he also mentions without quarreling. So this is a dispute. The word would have the ideas of dispute. So this isn't just kind of an argument and now we're on good terms. This is a dispute and we're keeping it alive because we just can't break free of the controversy. We're just going to keep this argument going. We're going to keep feeding the fuel. We're going to keep throwing wood on the fire. We're going to keep throwing gasoline on there. So this is kind of a disputing with a spirit of controversy. You're just going to have to do it. So this is going back to chapter 1, verses 5 through 7. And then I mentioned last week we want to see this with James 4, where James says, where do wars come from? Where do disputes come from? Where do quarrels come from? Are they not your passions? Are they not a lack of self-control? And of course the answer is yes. That's the rhetorical. He says, so you pray and you're heard, but you don't receive because there's all these things that are in the way. You ask, but you don't receive. So it's not just, James's point is kind of an internal, individual point. Paul brings this in and says, what can hinder the prayers of a church family is when there are brothers, there are sisters, and they're at odds. But we're gonna climb, a man will climb into this pulpit, and we're going to just pretend everything's okay, and we're going to pray in Jesus' name while there's quarreling and anger in the heart. That is unholy, says Paul. That's an unholy thing. So he kind of sets the men to the side, and it's not the best way to describe it, but he puts them under the microscope and essentially says, gentlemen, we got to handle this. And this has got to be settled because this is what's going on. And by the way, who doesn't want their prayers answered? No one. So why would we contribute to anger and quarreling that would keep that from happening? So that's just something to consider. So we left this with last week in verses 9 and 10. Let's look at 9 and 10. So he says likewise. So that word, it combines it. It joins the thought in verse 8. So likewise, also that women should adorn themselves in respectable apparel with modesty and self-control, not with braided hair and gold or pearls or costly attire, but with what is proper for women who profess godliness with good works. And in verse 11, he talks about a woman learning quietly. So what we have on here is this likewise. So this phrase, likewise, it joins. These are not independent, isolated thoughts. They are together. So men with their anger and their quarreling and perhaps some other underlying issues are contributing to the disruptions of the Ephesian church. But then you've got a group of women. And what happens in verses 9 through 10 is one group of women with their clothing, but there's more than that. There's more going on than just simply outside dress. And then verses 11 through 14 is one group of women and trying to take the teaching. So we're going to kind of isolate these, if you will, in that way. But Paul is an equal opportunist. He's telling everybody, it doesn't matter man or woman, the goal of a Christian in a local body is to contribute to the unity of the church, not to take away from it. The goal of the member, every member should be contributing to the peace and to the unity and the maturity of the growth of the church, not taking away from it. And that's what's happening in both cases. The men who are angling and quarreling, they are taking away from that. The women with their dress and whatever that way may be, they're taking away from that. And so is the other aspect. So we'll do these individualistic. But even though we're that approach, please remember the context. We'll do our very best to go with that. So this word adorn is where we get our word dress. So it's obviously we're thinking of that, thinking how we dress ourselves, how we clothe ourselves. We do this every morning. We got clothes. We decide what to wear. But what's interesting is at the end of verse 9, Paul will say that he mentions things. He mentions the aspect of it. So you've got braided hair, you've got gold, you've got pearls, you've got costly attire. So he's listing all of these things. So we cannot read into this to say that those things are bad. We got to be careful to not take this from a negative standpoint and say, oh, well, he's telling me never to braid my hair. He's telling me to never wear jewelry. He's telling me, nope, that's not what he's saying. So be careful to not read into the text what he is not saying. He's not saying any of that at all with that. So how are they to dress? Well, verse 9, Paul would say in the beginning of it that it should adorn, there's that dress, respectable apparel, modesty, and self-control. So he gives those three things. So respectable. This word respectable, I'm going from the English Standard Version. Being disciplined. It can mean well-arranged. It can mean honorable. It can mean sensible. And it can be modest. Did you know that in the next chapter, when we get into the qualities of an elder, that an elder is supposed to be modest? It's just not translated as modest. He is to be honorable in the sight of all. So our modesty has to do with our outside clothes, for sure. But our modesty also has to do with the inward person. And if you look at Paul and you look at Peter when they talk about these, and there are some other places, but Paul and Peter both do this in this passage, 1 Timothy 2, and then Peter in 1 Peter 3. They both talk about the inward person. They both go inward. And he tells, again, an elder, you are to be modest with your behavior. You are to be honorable with your behavior. Which we should already know this, because what did Paul say about all Christians in chapter 2 and verses 2 and 3? What did he say? What kind of life should we be living in verse 2? Okay, a peaceful life, quiet life, godly life, dignified life. That's everybody's clothing. That's how everybody is supposed to be. So this, in terms when Paul speaks of respectableness, that bridge is already crossed. It may be hard to hear, but I can accept it because we're already living a godly life, or we're supposed to. A godly life, dignified life, those types of things. So honorable, sensible, modest, disciplined, well-arranged, those things are certainly there. So let's talk a little bit about some whys. Why would Paul bring this up? Because he doesn't talk about it anymore. Let me get through this and then I'll get to you, Adam, okay? So the first thing is, what is the most notable, what is the primary religion in the city of Ephesus? It has to do with this temple. All right, the temple of Diana. So if you want to go back to see where really what influence that has, obviously look at your history, but go back to Acts chapter 19. And there you can find that. So the temple of Diana, those of you that study through the book of Ephesians thus far, what did you learn about the temple? Do you learn anything about it? You remember? It's obviously a religious center, but what else is it? You remember? Okay, so inside, when it comes to its worship, you have a cultic practice. So you got priests, you got priestesses, and then you've got, I'm going to, just for the sake of little ears, you've got a lot of physical things happening in the sense of that. So you have that taking place. So it's a worship place, very active, very religious. What else is it? Okay, so all right, so we got dress. What else is it? Okay, you could call it a brothel if you wanted. What else is it? It's a banking center. It's a banking center. So you do whatever it is that you do in your time of worship, but then it converts to a banking center because that's where your money is going to be. Because who is getting most of the money in the city? Who's getting the contribution? It only makes sense at this place. So this place is that. It's a place of worship. It's a place of, to a certain extent, what we would consider to be debauchery. But it's also a banking center. What else is it? This is what temples serve as, because the temple of the Jews served this way. Okay, it would be a social center. So just, hey, you would go on your lunch break. You'd go on what we called it a siesta, but they would have, they didn't have days off. So you worked 7 days a week. But what you did have was about a 4 to 5 hour period during the day, especially when it got hot, where you could go and take a break. So sometimes you could just go up to this place and you could take a break. You could have just well shaded and all of that, so you could go there. So it would be a very social center. There's another thing it would serve as. Where do you think all the records would be kept in a city? All the records would be kept. We call it a courthouse. But all the records, there are no such things as courthouses. Hey, we're going to go down to the courthouse and we'll get the birth certificate or we'll get the deed to the land. No, you don't do that. You go here. So this place, this temple right here, is the center of Ephesian life. You need money. You need to convert money. You go here. You want social acceptance, social, you want to go up the social ladder? You go here. You want to worship? You go here. You want to practice your religion? You go here. This is the center. And to a certain extent, when Christianity rises within this country, what was the social center of most towns and cities? Churches. Churches were. Because Christianity learned from a historical standpoint, we can be at the center, then you have everybody's attention, right? You have that. Churches kind of adopted that model because we realized that would be there. All of this is going to contribute with some of the things that we're going to say on some possible whys. So we'll look at the biblical context in just a moment. There's a historical context with this. Look at the attire that these women are wearing. Braided hair, gold, pearls, costly attire, costly clothes. What does that tell you about this particular group of women?
A lot of money was spent on this.
Okay, whatever it is, there's a lot of money. They're very wealthy. They're very affluent. What's the city of Ephesus? A very wealthy city, very affluent city. So part of the historical, well, go ahead, Adam.
Ephesus, the temple of Diana represented the moral and social standards of the city.
Yes.
It reflected what they believed in, the dress of the prostitutes coming out of that city every day.
Yes.
Reflected the moral standards of that city. And so now you got the church as a contrast. And many of the Christians down in there came from that lifestyle.
Mm-hmm.
So they've got to be taught now how to live.
They do. They do. And go ahead and mention this. I'll back up in just a minute. There's a book that was recently written. Someone shared with me a YouTube video of the author of this book. It's Wealth in Ancient Ephesus, in the first letter to Timothy. And it's this smaller part, just kind of this addendum, if you will. Fresh insights from the Ephisica by Xenophon of Ephesus. I know that you may look at it and say, that's boring, I can't say the name. But what's so important about this is that Xenophon was considered to be a contemporary of the Apostle Paul. And this individual wrote, this author, and did some of the research. So again, some of it is going to be subjective, as any of our research most likely will. But what his research revealed from the historical standpoint is that the women are coming over. People are being converted. So you look at Acts 19, people are being converted over to Christianity. But they're being converted, if you didn't hear Adam, they're being converted out of these pagan religions, being converted out of these pagan practices. How long does it take to teach somebody who's been in a pagan practice, maybe perhaps since they were born, but let's say 10 years. How long does it take to convert them out of the practice? How about the rest of our life? Rest of our life, right? So here's some of the things from the historical context. So one is that when you are going into the temple, if you are a woman, and women are allowed to teach, they are allowed to preach to use our word, they're allowed to have a very prominent role within the temple of Diana. that one of the ways in which you distinguished yourself from the common person, the layman, if you will, was how? Your clothing. How was the high priest distinguished from everyone else within Judaism? An ephod, certain types of clothing. If you look at it, he is distinguished so that you know you are separate and apart from that. Part of it, so when you are distinguished, it's not necessarily the clothes, but as much as you're getting what from people? Okay, somebody said respect. You said it, Mike. Attention. You're getting attention, okay? Your eyes go directly to whomever it may be, just because of what's there. What else would you get? How about listening ears? Just because of whatever's there. So you have these things, so women would have looked at it. If they're being converted out, men and women are both, but in this case, women are being converted out. If they're changing just from one God to another, granted they're still infants, so we got to be with that. If they're changing from one God to the other, how easy will it be to bring one practice to the other? Okay, we'll try to do it. It should be hard, Adam. It should be hard. But it will. We're just going to do it because just in that infant mind, it does what? Well, this is
Equal God.
Okay, equality. All right, we learn about this Jesus. We learn about this God, but we're still going to bring this over. Paul comes in and says this is not how Christianity works. The living God, the one living God, is not reflected in human dress in the sense of how you tell the story. That's not how it is. That's not how he does it. We'll talk about the dress in a minute. But what he's doing is correcting the mindset, at least, based on the author that we looked at, and just from a historical standpoint. If you're going to bring attention to God, it's not going to be through the vehicle that is dress. That's not how it's going to be done. So it's not that the pearls or the gold or the braided hair or the costly attire, it's not that they're not important. It's not that they are condemned, but it's the thought process behind it that says we're going to do this. But inadvertently, when you come into Christianity, the attention is taking off of the one that should receive it from everybody. Everybody following? Everybody following? Okay. All right, so that would be the idea. Then, obviously, we won't stop there because we're human beings, so we never stop. What does the showing of wealth allow me to have?
Position.
Okay, position. What else does it allow me to have? Status, prominence, position. I'll be able to have that. And if you look at the early church, how poor was the early church? All right, it's very poor. Okay, yeah, in Jerusalem it's very poor. And it stays kind of that way, all the way even to Corinth, right? Their contribution is supposed to be sent. So what happens in the New Testament, Ephesus is not the only place. Corinth does this, and whomever James is writing to does this too, is that that prominence ends up coming, and two things happen on either extreme. On one extreme, if you look at Corinth in chapter 11, the wealthy or the rich just go on ahead and forget the poor. We're just going to go do this. You remember that's part of that division that's taking place. And in James, I have it up here, favoritism. Partiality. All right, because if I see somebody with status or position and everybody kind of wants that or feels that pull, what do you think I will do if I'm a poor person? And I notice person A here has wealth. I can just see it. What will I do? What will be the natural thing for me to do? Human thing. Sir? Sir? Drop out. It could be. Or if I'm living in a city of social status, and I'm living in a city of prominence, but I'm not prominent, and I don't have money, what's my next best way to gain prominence and status?
Gain favor with the ones that do.
All right, gain favor with the ones that do. And guess what James says in James chapter 2? You see somebody walking into your assembly, you see what they have, and they say, here's the best seat, or here's the seat, right? So you have that happen. So the backside of this, all of this is taking place in Ephesus. You see, the dress doesn't just do all of these other things. It brings in favoritism. It brings in social standing. The women are gaining the attention. You could say men if you wanted to do that as well. You're having all of these things taking place, and that's just the practical side. How disruptive could the assemblies become in Ephesus. Based on those factors. Just those factors alone. Pretty disruptive. Okay, you become subdivided. All right, now let's go up to 1 Timothy 5:11 through 16 and bring this element in as well. So if you want to turn there, you can. So while you're turning there, and we'll get here in a couple of weeks as well, but Paul is essentially the church, before the government took it away, we're responsible for taking care of our widows. That's what we're supposed to do. So so Paul's got to lay out though how do you do it? Do you just do every widow? What do you do? So he lays it out on how to do it. So in verse 11, this is what he has to say, 11 and following. But refuse to enroll younger widows. You want to know who's a younger widow? 59 and below. But refuse to enroll younger widows, for when their passions draw them away from Christ, they desire to marry, and so incur condemnation from having abandoned their former faith. Besides that, they learn to be idlers, going about from house to house, and not only idlers, but also gossips and busybodies, saying what they should not. So I would have younger widows marry, bear children, manage their households, and give the adversary no occasion for slander. For some have already strayed after Satan. If any believing woman has relatives who are widows, let her care for them. Let the church not be burdened, so that it may care for those who are truly widows. Wait till we get there and break that passage open. So one of the things that just to bring out is verse 11. Refuse to enroll younger widows, for when their passions draw them away from Christ, they desire to marry. Why would that desire be existing in the first century for a woman? All right, there's no safety net. Right? Most of them aren't going to be allowed on land. Rome is a little bit more open. Roman society is a little bit more open than Jewish society, but you're still going to struggle. You're still going to have that. And if you're a woman and you don't have a man, you don't have a son, you don't have a family to take care of you, even if it's a third or fourth cousin, it's kind of what's involved there. If you don't have somebody to take care of you, you got two options. What are your options? Okay, begging or prostitution. So I should say three. You find someone to marry. You find a way to remarry. So I should say that third one on there. It is very possible. It's very possible that in light of this, that the women dressing the way they are, even if they have a small amount of wealth, they're choosing to spend it this way because it's going to open the door and increase my opportunity or my chances of getting remarried. Yes, ma'am.
Verse 9, would that have something to do with the beginnings of women becoming nuns?
I have no idea. That's a good question, but
it sounds like that thought might have started at that time.
It's possible because later on we'll see those who kind of don't marry, don't eat certain foods. I don't know if it's starting in terms of Catholicism the way we think, but you have some very ascetic movements that are taking place that will become Gnostic, and other groups will come in as well. So this is not the beginnings of Catholicism, but you can see some reading back into the text and saying, perhaps one of the best ways to keep this from happening are to take vows of poverty, take vows of, my words, lesser things, not things of this world. Maybe more of a protective measure. Maybe. That's just Elisha, though, just reading into that.
It says about all the good works that they...
Right. Yeah. So the good works, and we'll see that in just a moment. So the possible whys, why would this be happening, and why is this disruption? Well, some may be looking to remarry or marry. Some flaunting their wealth, just showing it off. Some wanting to just be able to show kind of status, not necessarily wealth as much as status or position. Some just are confused because they're coming out of a pagan religion. We think this is how it's done or the way we're supposed to do it. Whatever it is, the thing about the dress and the modesty is that it shouldn't just stop with the clothes. We should be respectable for what we wear. All of us should. There shouldn't be a person here who looks at it and says, well, we should look. As much as we can, we should look at that. But there's other things that are going on behind this as well. So we're going to put it this way, if you will. One, this is our definition. Where's the discipline? Where's the self-control? This is what Paul mentions in this, that women should adorn themselves in respectable apparel with modesty and self-control. That it's not just modesty, but it's a reflection of self-control, which is one of the hardest things for any person to master. And yet, if you think of the proverb, the wisdom, a man without self-control is like a city without walls. That's what the proverb says. So what we do, and this is the same thing for the elder when he gets in, that his temperament and his attitude and who he is in terms of his character should be honorable. One of the characteristics that he should have is to be self-controlled. When you get into Galatians 5, who are we all to be? Self-controlled. That is a fruit of the Spirit. So this, I know we look at it and say, well, he's just it looks like he's just isolating women and picking on them. Well, he's dealing with a specific thing. But if I can stress to all of us, whether it's our clothes or whether it's our behavior or all of the above, everybody here should be practicing self-control or attempting to practice that. This is who we are. And in a society then and now that throws self-control out the window as fast as we can, that'll be one of the most radical types of living that we will have in our day and age. Adam?
Our dress must never be to draw a negative attention toward us, but always a positive attention toward us, be it man or woman.
Okay, yes. So in that, Paul will mention the word honorable. We need to, if I can expand for a moment, when we make decisions, we normally just go right or wrong. And we need to expand that. It's not just right or wrong. Healthy, unhealthy, helpful, unhelpful. Yes, good and bad. Constructive, deconstructive. We need to start filtering and expanding how we make decisions. That you just can't simply say right and wrong. Because we have to recognize in the text, this is subjective. Which means that something else has got to come in and be the deciding factor. So here, can I give you two? In 1 Corinthians 10:31, whether you eat or drink, do all to the glory of God. What happens if we ask a question that sounds like this? If I wear this, do this, say this, speak this, think this, does it bring glory to God? What if we ask that? All right, instead of just simply saying right or wrong, what if we ask in everything, does this bring glory to God? Because that's the task. That's our task. And, sir? Don't we? We should. We should. And that's part of our maturation process. Right? So we see Israel, just to borrow from Exodus, they have to be told, thou shalt not. Just like we do with our 5-year-old. You got to this is it. We don't leave room for that. But life isn't always thou shalt not, which means we got to learn to be wise. Which means that we have to learn, if we are followers of God, what brings glory to God. And that includes how we dress. Hebrews 13:18 speaks of that as well, in terms of glory to God. But then it's also revealed. So Adam, you mentioned a positive, right? It needs to be reflective. Jesus would step into this and he would say, whether it's our dress, whether it's our attitude, all the above. How does what you're doing, how does what you're saying, how does what you're thinking, again, trying to cover all bases, how does it help me? If I've got to make a decision, how does this help me be the salt of the earth, light of the world, and reveal my Father to the people around me? What if everything that we had to make decisions about, besides just simply right and wrong, what if we taught ourselves and we passed it on to all the generations beyond us? Does this help me be the salt of the earth? Because that's what I am. You are the salt of the earth. Does this help me be the light of the world? Because he says, you are the light of the world. Does this help me be a city on a hill? because you are a city on a hill. And he says all of those things, and then he finally comes to the very end in verse 16, Jesus does, and says, so that when they see you, they see who? They see your Father and do what? Glorify Him. Peter speaks of the same thing in 1 Peter 2. Royal priesthood, chosen race, holy nation. Keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable, so that at the specific time they will do what? Glorify God. In the end, one way or the other, God receives the glory, or He should. Our lives, all of us, should be in that. Society, first century, 21st century, is not interested in that. It's just not the way it's supposed to be. It should be. That's not the interest. It's all the way back to Genesis 11 with Babel. Which means that the kingdom of God has got to be more than that. We have, with our decision-making process, when it comes to our clothes, when it comes to our attitude, when it comes to our behavior, when it comes to everything that we call life, this is what it's supposed to be. This is what Paul is dealing with. Poor Timothy's just got to kind of step into that and deal with it, which is no easy task. And I know this is not an easy lesson for any of us, and never is. Because I have to consider my dress, but I also got to consider my attitude. And I got to consider the heart. I got to consider, when I put it together, when Elisha's got to make decisions where there is no clear right or wrong or good or bad, what happens if I put to the very top, does this bring glory to God? Because that's my task. I know that. Does it bring glory? Does it bring honor? It's not honorable dress just for the sake of honorable dress. It's honorable so that I can bring honor to Him. And the church at Ephesus can't do this if these disruptions continue. Because God is most honored in the church when she is unified, when she is at peace, and when she is on mission. And when she is in not one of those places or all three of those, then whatever's taking place needs to be corrected. But it's not because I said it, or Timothy said it, or even Paul said it. Because this is what God desires for all of us. So perhaps this week, I wonder what it would look like for all of us if our lives went and said, regardless of whether it's dress, words, attitude, He says, I am the salt of the earth, the light of the world, and the city on a hill. What would it look like if I made all decisions through those three realities? You'd have a very good week. Have a very good week. Have a very good week. And I wonder if we would find peace and unity and the gospel at the end. And of course, Jesus does all of this because that's who He is. So very quickly, and then we'll turn it over. Scott has a few prayer requests. In the end, what should be concentrated on? What should time, resources, focus be concentrated on for women? And then obviously expands to men in the church. Godliness, good works. Which we already know because Ephesians 2:10 tells us right after grace has saved us that we were created in Him for good works. So once we make the decision, glory, honor, and so forth and so on, what if we spent as much time focusing on how we can do good works for the Lord and for the people around us as opposed to all the other? If we got to draw attention, and we are, one way or the other, we either draw it to ourselves or we draw it to God. We got to draw attention. Let's do it in a good way. Let's bring glory and honor to Him. 1 Timothy 2:15, chapter 5, 9 through 10, verse 14 speak of the good works. And he expands it in those chapters. So it's not just women. So ladies, I don't want you to think this is just, oh, He isolated, He put us on the bullseye. This is for all of us. All of us should be focused on good works. All of us should be focused on all of these things. This is what we should be spending our time. If we got to give thought to something, give thought to that. But let's also make sure that our dress, that we are bringing glory and honor to Him in all the ways that we can, in whatever that may be. So Ephesians 2:10, I have that up there. Ephesians 5:21 speaks of this as well, where a husband and wife are to do that as well. So this was a lot of information. Thank you for letting me lecture a little bit more than usual. But this was a lot to be able to put into it. But I hate to tell you that we're going to have even more lectures because we're getting into a very, very convoluted text. We alluded that So here's what I need you to do if you're taking notes in preparation for next week, please. I need you to read 1 Timothy 2, and I need you to read verses 11 through the end of the chapter. But I also need you to read 1 Corinthians, and I need you to read chapters 11 through 14 if you can. So that's a chapter a day. That's not too bad. I think we can handle that, Lord allows. But what we need to do is that, what I plan to do is we deal with this topic of women and teaching and their role within the life of the congregation. Is that even though Ephesus did not have the opportunity to say, turn to 1 Corinthians and let's see what Paul wrote there, we do. So we need a well-rounded view. So we're going to look at that. But we also need to look at other ways in which this is going to be interpreted, and we need to consider that. So we're going to bring all of that. So I need you to kind of read that, familiarize yourself with that. We're going to break it down. This is the type of thing I love. Forgive me if that's not your cup of tea, but I'm hoping you're getting something out of this. I hope it's challenging for you. In the end, and turning it over to Scott, in the end, it's about peace and unity and the gospel. Amen. Church, let's focus on that. But let's make sure we are contributing to those in all the ways that we can and not just the other, okay? So I appreciate you being here. Yes, ma'am.
I got a question. You said 1 Corinthians chapters 11 to 14?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Yep. Chapters 11 through 14. Now, we'll start that next week. We'll be in that text for quite a while, so just get comfortable in that, on that. Scott.